Settlement and Revolution. Just as I hoped that you would go down to the LBL, I hope that sometime, if you haven't already, get to go to Western Kentucky and look out across those beautiful mountains. As you learned from your text, Boonesboro was not the first lasting settlement in Kentucky. It was Harrodsburg. Yes, there were people in Kentucky, the Long Hunters, the Indians, but the first lasting settlement, the title goes to Harrodsburg, established in 1774, although it was 1775 before we really got going good on the building of it. But your text gives you very little information about James Harrod, and James Harrod is one of the most interesting men in Kentucky history to me because there's a number of mysteries about him. We don't know, for instance, the exact date of his birth, nor the exact time or manner of his death. But we do know pretty much what happened in between. We know he was born sometime after 1742 and before 1746. We know he was born in Pennsylvania, one of a dozen children of a man named John Harrod and his second wife. We know he had very little formal education, although he was far from illiterate. He kept extremely well-written records. He also was very quick to be able to learn Indian languages. Just a few days in an Indian camp and he could pick up their language. He was also fluent in French. And like so many of our early colonists, his life was shaped by Indians. His father's first wife and one of his brothers had been killed by Indians. And he wrote, as a child, he remembered his mothers and his brothers and his sisters fleeing their cabin just before Indians would attack. And as they looked back, they could see their home burning and hear their friends crying out as they were being killed by the Indians. Yet, with all of this, he never came to hate Indians, nor did he kill Indians indiscriminately. But he did become an excellent marksman and a very fine hunter. In appearance, he was a very tall, erect man with jet black hair and a big, full black beard. He served in the militia in the 1755s, and he also served in the French and Indian War. And after the French and Indian War, like so many others, he succumbed to the lure of the land across the mountains. At first, he went to the Illinois country, and he made trips down into present-day Kentucky and on into Tennessee. And on one of his trips into Kentucky, he actually met Daniel Boone. We know he was here in 1770. We know he was here in 1773. We know in 1773 he was on that survey party where he just disappeared. He went looking for a place for him to set up his own little establishment. And in 1774 he left Pennsylvania with 32 men and traveled downriver the Ohio up the Kentucky River and established a small settlement. And there was 32 men, and they drew lots as to who was going to live where. So Harrodsburg holds the distinction of being the first lasting settlement in Kentucky, not Boonesboro. And I've already learned from your text that because of Indian problems, he did leave the area in October of 74 and didn't come back for 6 months. Then he returned and began building a fort, and when he got back, he discovered the McPhee brothers were already there. And we have the example of one of our first disputes over land ownership. It will not be the last. This one was settled very peacefully, but later on down the road there will be lawsuits. Meanwhile, a man called Judge Henderson and his Transylvania company are in the area. And Harrod and his fellow colonists, they just do not accept Henderson's dominance or his claim that he owns all of Kentucky. And James was very responsible for leading us, how we say, successful protest against him. But when Virginia created the county of Virginia, it made Harrodsburg the county seat, and Harrod was elected the county representative to see that he could get to go to Virginia Assembly. Now, twice in 1776 and 77, Harrod did lead groups eastward to get provisions and gunpowder. Because although we had a lot of land and a lot of game, that's one thing we were short on, was gunpowder. And he and his men at the fort had several fights with the Indians when they would try to attack. He also led several difficult expeditions against the Indians in what we call the Northwest Territory, which is the land north of the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. He did this in 80 and 82 and 86. But in time, the revolution's over and peace comes to Kentucky, and Harrod settled into the comfortable life of a very well-to-do farmer. Because of what he had accomplished and bought, he had acquired 1,300 acres of Bowling Springs and 20,000 more acres all across the state. But he had one main farm that he worked, and he worked it with 6 slaves. And he had cattle and sheep and hogs and horses. Now, all this time, he's been busy. He's a veteran of the Revolutionary War, a veteran of the French and Indian War, a veteran of Lord Dunmore's War. He's a good Indian fighter. He's a well-respected man. He established the first settlement. And as so often happens, he's been so busy he hasn't had time to get married. But he met a very young, cultured 22-year-old widow with a very young son and fell head over heels. And not that it matters, but the boy's name just happened to be James. So James is in his middle to late 30s, and his young bride is in her early 20s. And even though she was young and he was virile, it seemed to take 7 years before Mrs. Harrod actually presented her husband with a child. And then that child was not the long-awaited for and hoped-for son. It was a daughter. And although James wasn't, well, he was a little disappointed, but he had his stepson, who he'd come to think of as his own. Unfortunately, 2 years later, in November of '87, young James is captured by Indians and burned alive at the stake. And the elder James took it extremely hard. Like so many people, male and female, when we get hurt, we retreat into ourselves. And James began to take long hunting trips, days, weeks at a time. And during the winter of 1792, right after we had become a state, James took a long hunting trip and never came back. We don't know whether he was taking what they call a wilderness divorce, where he just kept on walking, whether he was killed and captured by the Indians. Did he have an accident? Did someone else kill him? We don't know. But his wife/widow married again very shortly, and she hadn't been married but just a few weeks, and all of a sudden she decides to have the marriage annulled because she knows that her husband's alive. So she gets an annulment, no more married, and as soon as she gets the annulment, she immediately says, "Oh, James is dead, someone's found his bones," and applies for his pension. So she couldn't get his pension if she'd remarried. Now, there was a rumor that a man named Bridges had killed him. They said they had found a skeleton with his clothes. There was a rumor that the Indians had captured him, but they're all rumors. We don't know. Did he just keep on walking? Did he fall down a cliff and break his neck? Did the Indians capture him and kill him? Did he maybe perhaps take his own life? We don't know. But there's not a known gravesite for him. There's no known for sure date of death. We just know that during the winter of 1792 was the last time he was seen alive. He never gained the fame that Daniel Boone did. Why? Even though he did so much for Kentucky? Maybe it was because nobody wrote a story about him. But back in pioneer days in Kentucky, even though the McPhees were there and he was there, usually if you planted a crop and erected a structure, the state of Virginia or the county of Virginia or the colony of Virginia would recognize you as having a land claim. And Harrod did have the crop planted and a structure erected before the McPhees showed up. Also in March of 1775, and your text relates this way, well, I'm not going to go into detail about that, Boone blazes a wilderness trail. And I believe the first documented account of connection between Henderson and Boone is when, I think it was 1770, Judge Henderson issued a warrant for his arrest for non-payment of bills. And it's long been assumed by historians that the judge agreed to cancel the warrant and clear his name, so to speak, on the courts if Boone would lead this expedition into Kentucky for him. And your text explains how Henderson bought the land, supposedly bought the land from the Cherokee. But on the way out, and then when they got here, 3 men were killed by the Indians, and some settlers actually left. Another died, and then all of a sudden the Indians are gone. But meanwhile, Boone had sent this really nice letter to Boone. In other words, get yourself out here with help and supplies. The Indians are after us. Well, by the time Henderson arrives, the Indians are gone. And he's having trouble even getting people to finish building the walls because no Indians, no fear, let's do our own thing. I hope that you were surprised and amazed at the fact that people are giving away not just acres, but they're giving away tens of thousands of acres. And Henderson promising all those thousands of acres to somebody who can get him out there quickly. We just can't visualize that. Well, it did take long before there's a food shortage. Why? Because when we first got there, there was really an abundance of deer and antelope and buffalo and antelope and everything. But when you keep killing things close to where you live, pretty soon the game doesn't come, and you got to go further and further and further away. Not a good idea. The further away you get from the settlement, the more of a target you are by the Indians. But in June, Daniel leaves to go back to Carolina and get his wife, because the only one that came with him was his daughter, his newly married daughter. The wife stayed at home because she was in, well, shall we say, with child. When he gets back there, he finds that Rebecca's in the 9th month of a difficult pregnancy. So he waits for it, and she has the baby, and the baby dies, and she still can't leave right away. Richard Calloway, name to remember, doesn't like Boone. He thinks he should have been placed in charge of this business by Henderson. He has a higher rank in the militia, number one. He's older than Boone. He thinks he's better than Boone. And he's going to cause Boone some problems very shortly. This is a pen and ink drawing of Richard Henderson, and I think it's kind of flattering if you want to know the truth. I've given you a little bit of information here. The text also gives you information about the Transylvania Company and the fact that he was a lawyer and how he came about buying, supposedly, quote unquote, 17 million acres of land from the Indians. That they didn't own it in the first place, but that's another story. And like I said, the first documented case, Boone didn't just want another settlement, although there was talk for a while of making it the 14th colony. What he wanted to do was he wanted a kingdom. He's going to cause problems. So you've got James Harrod, Boonesboro, and now you've got Benjamin Logan and John Floyd that are actually mentioned. We don't know who Benjamin Logan was traveling with when he left, but he broke off and went to a place called Alsop, A-S-A-P-H, which later becomes known as Logan's Fort, and one of the better known forts and well protected forts. And Benjamin Logan was quite a good hunter and dead-eye shot. He became the leader, so the name was changed, but it's known interchangeably as either Alsop or Logan's Fort. It's the same location. John Floyd was another man whose name keeps coming up. He was coming back from Carolina with 30 men, and he decided not to go to Boonesboro. He broke off and went to Logan's Fort. Now, I've got 3 words that are gone a lot. Yeah, when you get right down to it, all these men, no matter who they were, whether they were Logan, Floyd, Boone, or Harrod, they were gone a lot. Not because they didn't like their wives or their home life, but they had to be gone a lot to scout for Indians, to hunt for food. It was just a necessity. So women were alone a lot. Now meet George Rogers Clark, one of my most favorite people in Kentucky history. He is tall, slim, educated, from a well-to-do family. Is over 6 foot tall, has flaming red hair, a true frontiersman. The Native Americans called him Long Knife, which I'll explain in a few minutes. He was well respected by men who would follow him to their death. He was a good leader. He's born in Small Plantation in Charlottesville, Virginia. And although he was upper middle class, they weren't in the ultra class. But they did know the Virginia Lees, they knew the Washingtons, they knew the Jeffersons, they knew the Henrys. And although not close, hey buddy type friends, they did know each other and traveled in the same social circles. So George grew up very well pampered. And by the way, he is the oldest son, be the oldest brother, I guess you'd say, of the Clark family of the Lewis and Clark expedition in about 30 years. But Georgia had a rudimentary education because back in those days, you had a tutor come to your home to teach your eldest son how to read and write. And if they wanted to be a lawyer or something, he would just go to where a lawyer was and study under him. And if he was proficient in his field, he didn't have colleges per se at that point. At the ripe old age of 20, 1772, he decided it's time to leave home and strike out on his own. So he buys surveyor's instruments and gets a job with the Ohio Land Company surveying. And he journeys all along the Ohio River and the Fish Creek in Pennsylvania and the Kanawha River in the Carolinas. So over the next 4 years, up to 1776, he did guide work for settlers. He located land claims for himself and his family. He established communities, one of them which was Leesburg, which is now part of Frankfort, Kentucky. But when he came into Kentucky, he fell in love with the beautiful lands. The only problem was the Indians. They seemed to believe that the land was theirs, and were very fiercely defensive of anyone trying to take their land. Now, it's been said when he showed up in Harrodsburg, he said, "My name is Clark, and I come out to see what you brave fellows are doing in Kentucky, and to lend you a hand if necessary." Did he actually say that? Possible. It's quite possible. But there again, that falls into the heading of legend has it. At the beginning, the revolution's beginning about this time, and of course the English, although we didn't have any British attacks, the British were encouraging the Indians to kill settlers, and were even supplying them with munitions. Because of the increased harassment of the Indian tribes and the seemingly indifference toward Kentucky by the Virginia legislature, Clark gets together and calls a meeting of representatives from all the different forts and settlements to elect someone to go to Williamsburg and see about getting some help. Well, if you've ever been to a club meeting and you showed up late and you got there, you discovered you'd been elected to something, well, this is what happened to Clark. He got the meeting late, and when he got there, he discovered he was one of 2 men elected to go to Williamsburg to seek assistance. But when he gets there, the Virginia Assembly has disbanded. The new governor of the Virginia state is Patrick Henry, is sick, home in bed, and refuses to even talk to him. He finally uses his family connections to get in to see the governor. And the governor tries to explain to him that there's nothing he can do. They're busy setting up a new government. This is a new country. We're getting ready to fight the British. There's just so much to do here. We can't be concerned with a few hundred people out there over the mountains. And it's at this point in time that he is said to have said, "I'm sorry to find that you should have to seek help. We will have to seek help elsewhere, because if a country is not worth protecting, it's not worth claiming." Well, what other alternative do they have? They could completely separate from Virginia, become their own country. They could seek help from the British? No. The Spanish to the south. Well, that's the last thing that the Virginia colony or Virginia state wanted, was to have anything to do with the Spanish. So he managed not only talk them into giving them some gunpowder, 500 pounds of gunpowder. After they said first you'd have to pay it, and then you have to loan it to them. After a long hassle, they got 500 pounds of gunpowder, and declared the area known as Kentucky, which had been part of Fincastle County, now its own separate county. It was now called the County of Kentucky and recognized as being part of Virginia. And Clark, at only 24 years old, was given command of the new Kentucky militia. And therein lies the story. They also declared Henderson's purchase through the Transylvania Company was null and void, which made everybody very happy. Now, before we get into the Revolution, let's talk just a few minutes about the fort. As you can see from this picture, yes, it's a reenactment. It's built with things we had today, but we had the same type of stuff available at that time. It's got walls, which were impregnable to the arrows, and the type of gun or cannon that the Indians and the British were using were small. The barrel of the gun was only about maybe 2 feet long, so the cannonball projected wasn't that large, and they would usually bounce off these walls. So you had protection from the elements, you had protection from the Indians and wild animals, but they were not very many of them. I mentioned Martins and Ruddles. They were stations before they became forts. There was Fort Boonesborough, Fort Harrodsburg, Logan's Fort, but they were compared to the other areas, other things called stations. They had the advantage. Like I said, they were safe from the elements. The disadvantage is when there's so many people there. And when you got a lot of people in one crowded area, you're going to have problems. Disease spread like wildfire. There's no sanitation. There's no privacy. They're small. They're dirty. And it's not a place you want to stay for a long time. It's a temporary shelter only. Whereas a station is 1 or 2 cabins that you can defend yourself with. They've got, the gun slits in the walls. But they're temporary. And one station can't hold off a large attack by Indians. You get maybe 1 or 2 or a small group. But if you get more than 5 or 10 Indians, and one station is not going to be able to stand up against it. So the station was temporary, and there were numerous. stations. And of course, Revolution in Kentucky, the settlements, the forts are all under attack by Indians, not the English redcoats. And of course, the stations and cabins were attacked, and settlers would leave and have to seek protection in the forts. Meanwhile, the Indian chief we met last lesson, Cornstalk, is attempting peace. He sees the handwriting on the wall, so to speak. He realizes these white men are just more numerous than fleas on a hound dog, and there's just not much he can do about it. But he gets killed by some white men. And the new Indian chief, Blackfish, he is all for going to go war against these white people. They're worse than yeast. They just keep coming and spreading. And the Indian culture is a warrior culture, so you're setting yourself up big time. Meanwhile, an Englishman by the name of Henry Hamilton, by the English, was named as commander of the English fort in Detroit. He got the nickname the Hair Buyer because he was paying rather heavy bounty for not just American scalps, but for Kentucky scalps. Simon Kenton. If you ever get a chance to read a biography of anyone from Kentucky, pick Simon Kenton. He's quite a dude. I've given you the basics. He's a scout and friend of Boone's, saved Boone's life. But he was born in Virginia. And when he was 16, he thought he'd killed a man in a jealous rage over the love of a girl. And he fled into the wilderness. Now, that is a summation of it, but let me put just a little bit more flesh on that for you. As you can see from the picture, this is, of course, when he's older. He was a big boy, rough and tumble. And when he was 16, he spotted this young girl at Mill Run, and he said he's going to marry her. So he tells all of his buddies he's going to marry her. He tells his parents he's going to marry her. The only problem was he forgot to tell the girl. So meanwhile, she goes off with somebody else and gets married to him. Well, Simon is just furious. So he shows up at the wedding drunk, makes a fool of himself, and the bridegroom and his friends proceed to stomp the stuffings out of him. Well, he's so embarrassed, he's going to get even with the bridegroom. So he buys his time and he waits till he catches the bridegroom alone. They get in a fight. The bridegroom had real long hair and he got tangled in some brush, and Simon, he's tied to the ground basically with his hair tangled in the brush, and Simon just beating the living daylights out of him, and he goes limp. So Simon thinks he's killed him. And even at 16, you can be hung for murder, so he decides to take off, and he goes into the wilderness in Kentucky and Ohio, changes his name to Butler, and lives for years out there, becomes a good hunter, a good scout, a good friend of everybody. Now, in 1782, he did find out that he hadn't killed the guy, so he goes back to see his parents and his family, and goes back to his original name of Simon Kenton, and he gets married and comes on back to Kentucky, where he lived to the ripe old age of 81. Now, that's his life story, basically. But there's a lot of interesting stuff between. He gets captured. His greatest game, he loved to play games and tricks on the Indians. He liked to go to an Indian camp and steal their Indians, get on a horse, and ride crazy like through the Indian village, screaming at the top of his lung, taking the Indians' horses with him. He was a big tease. That was his favorite thing to do. And the Indians hated him for it. And they did eventually capture him and just darn near killed him. But you got to read his life story to get into all that. Very interesting man. But during the Revolution, he was stationed basically at Boonesboro. And he became a scout, and he would go between different forts and deliver messages, and he'd hunt and bring things back. He and Boone became great friends, and Boone respected him. Boone said he was the only man that could ever sneak up on him. Meanwhile, Blackfish brings his Indians and crosses the Ohio River into Kentucky. They attack Boonesboro. It's there that Kenton saves Boone's life. And it also then introduces you to someone called Simon Girty. Now, Simon Girty is a white man, but he was captured by the Indians at a very early age and lived with the Indians for several years before he escaped. Well, he's not a nice man. He really isn't. And after the war started and the English began to offer amnesty to any American who would change their allegiance from the colonial revolutionaries to King George, they were offered amnesty. Well, Colonel Hamilton of Detroit sent out this same statement, and Girty and some of his friends took him up on it. They became allies with the English, and because he spoke the Indian language and didn't like the colonists, they used him to lead Indian attacks against the white settlers. He was called the Great Renegade, which is one of the nicest things you could call him, because his pet thing to do was he loved to watch the Indians torture and kill white prisoners. He was not a nice man. Meanwhile, 1778. Well, game is getting further and further away from home, and you can cut back on a lot of things, but you've got to have salt. You have to prepare and preserve your meat, and to can things with. You've got to have salt. So they're running out of salt. So Boone leads his party out into the wilderness. He's going to hunt while they're boiling down water to make salt. And your text does a pretty good job explaining this. As a matter of fact, the little YouTube I've got to show you, a reenactor portraying Boone tells you the story of how he was captured and what happened afterward. It's close to your book account, but it's kind of cute seeing someone sitting there on the ground fingering a long Kentucky rifle telling you about how he got captured. He's captured by Blackfish, and he ends up making a deal with him that he would talk the salt makers into surrendering if he wouldn't try to kill him. He says, there's more of you, there's hundreds of you and just a few of us, and you will take us, but we're going to take some of you with us. So isn't it better to save your warriors and let's surrender? And he said, I'll also talk the people at Fort Boonesboro into surrendering next spring. Because right now, it's coming into wintertime, these old folks and these women and children, they never survive a forced march from Boonesboro to Detroit. So the Indians took a vote, and by a very slim margin, they agreed to accept Boone's terms. Well, Boone took a lot to convince those salt makers to surrender, but surrender they did, and they get taken to Detroit. And along the way, Blackfish forces Boone to run the gauntlet, and he's going to adopt him. Well, part of the adoption ceremony is a cleansing. So the Indian women take Boone down to the river, and bathe him in the cold water, and pick every hair on his body off, one hair at a time. Then he's adopted by Mr. Blackfish. Meanwhile, we have some of the salt makers escape, some of them are ransomed back out, but Boone's still sticking around. And he begins to hear about the Indians are planning on a spring offensive to attack Boonesboro, so he does escape after 6 months. He gets back to Fort Boonesboro and discovers his family's gone because they thought he was dead, so they went back to Carolina. He talks them into reinforcing the walls, and time goes by, and of course they don't believe him because there's no Indians. Days go into weeks, and weeks go into weeks more, and they say he's lying. And one day he had a hunting party out, and he discovers, ooh, here they come. He goes back to the fort. Yeah, they're here. The Indians show up, and they've got some white Englishmen with them. Simon Girty was with them, and Blackfish was with them. And they want to parley because Boone had agreed to, surrender the fort. Well, they're stalling for time, hoping somebody will show up. And Boone will go out and talk to him, and he goes back into the fort, and he takes hours to do what to take 5 minutes to do, and time goes on, and it's obvious that they're stalling in the fort. So the Indians try to dig a hole under the walls and the whole bit. Well, time goes by, and the whole time they're sniping at each other, and 37 different Indians were killed, but meanwhile only 2 in the fort were killed. Well, it didn't take long before the Indians realized that this ain't gonna work. So they leave. And as soon as they're gone, remember Richard Callaway, he filed charges of treason against Boone, saying that he really was going to surrender the fort. So they have a military trial, and Boone explains to them how he was trying to save the fort and save the people, and because of what he did, none of the salt makers got killed. Boonesboro was not attacked for about 8 months, and there were only 2 people killed in the fort after all this time. So they believed he had been really trying to save the fort. They found him innocent and even promoted him in the militia. And Callaway is livid. Meanwhile, Blackfish sees that things are not going his way. He breaks his big lark war party up into small parties and begins attacking the outlying stations. Meanwhile, the best defense is a good offense. So George Rogers Clark had gone to the governor with a plan. He said, the best way to keep the Indians from attacking people in Kentucky is to get rid of the Indians north of the Ohio. And what we need to do is go up there and get rid of all those Illinois Indians and go all the way to Detroit and take Detroit. So your text does a good job relating that. So we're going to have this offensive. He takes about 175 men, marches from the Falls of Ohio, Louisville, to Kaskaskia. Now, folks, I drive that road. Was it Interstate 64? I pick it up at just north of Evansville and go all the way to St. Louis. It takes me 2 hours to get from Evansville to Kaskaskia driving. I can't even imagine what it was like walking from Louisville that far. But they retake Cahokia, Vincennes, and Vincennes was a French village, of course, and they'd been told how bad the Long Knives, which is what they were called, because of after you fire the first shot from your gun, you haven't got time to take time to reload, so you've got a tomahawk in one hand and this really long slam blade. It's, oh, I say 8-10 inches long and slim and sharp on both sides. This is your killing tool. This is what you use to fight with, and you can't get too close with that long knife. It's going to poke you. So Clark and his men were called Long Knives, and the French people in Vincennes had been told horrible stories about what the Long Knives were going to do to them. But they managed to take Cahokia and Vincennes, you know, no problem whatsoever. So he convinces them he's not going to hurt them, and calls some of the Indian chiefs from the local Indian tribes together and gets them all together. And this is supposed to be from a speech to the Indian chiefs at Cahokia in 78. He said, quote, "I carry in my right hand war, and peace in my left. Here is a bloody belt and a white one. Take which you choose. This is a fight among family. No one wants to get involved in a fight between family members." And the fact he's running a bluff, just like he did with Governor Patrick Henry when he sent his seek help elsewhere. This is a bluff, plain, pure, and simple, because he hasn't got but 175 men against all these Indians in the Illinois country. But they agree with him. A lot of them actually decided to back off. Meanwhile, although we don't fight in the wintertime, and Colonel Hamilton, the governor of Detroit, had retired for the winter, he heard about Clark taking Vincennes. So he gets up a bunch of Indians and a bunch of English militia and heads for Vincennes and retakes Vincennes. Meanwhile, George Rogers Clark is out trying to dum up. They've kind of retired for the winter too. He's trying to get supplies and help, and he goes to St. Louis. He talks to some Spanish, and it's during this time the rumor starts that he's too friendly with the Spanish, and he's having an affair with a Spanish girl. Legend, quote unquote. Did he or not? He never writes of it. Nothing ever came of it. He never married. Did he have an affair with a Spanish girl in St. Louis? I don't know. More power to him if he did. He gets a ship called the Willing and starts making supplies. He's going to have it once he learns that Vincennes has been retaken by Colonel Hamilton. The long trip is long, wet. It's been an extremely wet weather. The entire plains out around that area is covered in water. They march in water for days. They finally get to Vincennes, and of course Clark is there. I mean, not Clark, but Hamilton is there. He has settled in for a long winter's nap. But George Rogers Clark realizes if they wait until the spring when you're supposed to do your fighting, Colonel Hamilton will have people come down from Canada and Detroit by the hundreds, more Indians and more Englishmen and some Canadian militia, more than he can handle. So he needs to strike now and strike fast, much like when Washington crossed the Delaware in 76. In the December the 25th, he's crossing the Delaware. Nobody fights on Christmas Day. Nobody fights in the winter. But Washington did a surprise attack and took Trenton. So this is what Clark's going to do. He's going to surprise attack on Vincennes, and he got there, surrounded the town, started shooting. And at first, the Colonel Hamilton thinks it's people celebrating for drinking and celebrating. And then it finally dawns on him the town is surrounded. Clark demands surrender, and Hamilton's stalling. So about this time, some Indian scouts return carrying American scalps, and the Clark's men capture them, take them out in front of the fort, and use a tomahawk and proceed to tomahawk them to death in front of the fort. Hamilton realizes this time that this man's nuts. He's crazy. Meanwhile, Clark had his men march around the fort, and every time they got on the other side of the fort, they'd change battle flags. So by marching around 2-3 times with different battle flags, Colonel Hamilton thought he had hundreds of men out there instead of 175. So on February the 25th, Hamilton does surrender. Finally, they're ship the willing arrives, and also brings supplies and news that there's a new Virginia county. We now have the county of Kentucky. We now have the Illinois county. So Clark has done a heck of a lot defending Kentucky. Although it wasn't done in Kentucky, he was defending Kentucky by eliminating the threats. And Hamilton is taken as a prisoner back to Virginia. So Clark deserves, very well deserves, the title of Father of Kentucky. Meanwhile, even though he's taking care of the activity over there, the Indian activity does increase, but the Revolutionary ends, and Cornwallis surrenders in 1781. But 1782 is called the Year of Blood, because the Indians couldn't care two hoops and a holler whether the war was over or not. But also the population is starting to grow a little bit more in Kentucky, where we've been down to less than 200 population for a while. We're starting to build back up. But in March 1781, Wyandotte warriors attack. And the battle is described in your text, and of course it's an Indian win. Meanwhile, Simon Girty crosses the Ohio again with 50 Rangers, which are English and Canadian, and 300 Indians. And they attack Bryant Station, but they are defeated. And by the way, Bryant Station, the Bryants are cousins of Daniel Boone's wife, Rebecca Bryant, remember? When they couldn't trick them into leaving the station, and they were actually just a day or two early. If they went a day or two later, the men would have been gone, because the men were going to go out to other stations to help them. But the men had been delayed, and they didn't get gone, and the men were still there, and nobody was coming out. So they burned the outbuildings, they killed cattle, and destroyed crops. Meanwhile, a relief led by John Todd arrived. Boone's with them, and they're following a very easy trail to follow. And Boone is trying to tell them this is too easy, way too easy. We don't need to do this. This doesn't look good. So they follow them all the way to Licking River, and Boone urges them to wait for Logan's men to arrive, because he's supposed to have a couple of hundred men. And there's just not that many with Todd and Boone. Well, McGarry, a young major in the militia, he'd been chided earlier during the day for being a bit timid. So he rides his horse into the middle of the river and screams that if you're not a coward, follow me. And at this point in time, a man's manhood and the fact whether he was coward or brave was very important. So even Boone, against his better judgment, went across this river. And it was a trap. And although they split their men up into 3 sections and they thought that they had it all well taken care of, as soon as they crossed the river, after leaving their horses untended, the British and the Indians attacked. And 60 plus were killed within a matter of 15 minutes. Another one of Boone's sons gets killed. Boone did manage to escape. And by the time they got back, their horses were already gone, and the Indians were following them across the river. And the Indians chased them for about 3 miles, and they decided to go back and scalp and mutilate the bodies of the men who had been left. It was the worst defeat ever of the Indian Wars, and there is a document of a page and a half in your file that you should read. Like I said, it doesn't change the outcome of the fight. It gives you a little bit more perspective. Simon Girty was there, but what he was thinking and what Boone was supposedly thinking. And of course, every defeat has to have a scapegoat. McGarry, the young major, was blamed for goading them to coming in. He says, not my fault, it's Logan's fault. He should have been there with more men. Logan says, it's not my fault, it's Clark's fault. He was off in the Illinois country. He should have been here defending Kentucky. The old saying in the military is it runs downhill. Everybody was blaming everybody else. And Clark continues to go against the Indians, but he gets little or no support because we're starting to be very parochial in our look. We don't want to go outside of Kentucky. We want to protect Boonesboro. We want to protect Harrodsburg. We don't want to go into Indiana or Illinois. So in March of 1782, Clark is notified that his enemies have gotten to the new governor. And a few months later, he's given permission to retire. Don't you love that? Given permission to retire. He was never repaid the money he used for buying supplies for the men during the Illinois campaign. He'd done everything he could, and nothing in return. They did give him a few thousand acres, but nothing to compensate for what he had to sell to come up with the money for them. No man did more to save Kentucky during this most perilous days than did Clark. He truly deserves the title of the Father of Kentucky. And although he did in later life partake of the grape a bit much, and was even at one point in time offered a commission in the French army. It's almost ridiculous to think about it. We'll learn more about him in another decade or so. He gets involved because of the, believe it or not, French Revolution. But he gave his all to protect Kentucky, the land that he loved. He deserves the title of Father of Kentucky. Meanwhile, right before the war ended, Spain entered the war as an ally of England. And her reward after the war was to gain Florida. So after the war, the boundaries of the new United States were what we would call the Canadian border now, Spanish Florida, and everything east of the Mississippi. And all the colonists had really wanted was just that little piece of land hugging the Atlantic. We were just thrilled to death to get that much land. So where Spain had Florida, we forced her to give it up. England forced her to give it up during the French and Indian War. Now she's getting it back at the end of the Revolution. So from Spanish Florida to Canada, north and south, the Atlantic Ocean on the west, the Mississippi River on the west. Survival had been the main concern for the men and women of Kentucky, not fights with the British redcoats. Brother, we lived in fear of Indian attacks. Because in an Indian attack, if you were captured, you would not always be killed. You would be tortured. But events occurring and future Indian problems are going to put Kentucky on her road to statehood. So after you viewed your YouTube, your Daniel Boone, you read your chapter in that brief page-and-a-half document on the Battle of Blue Licks, and of course you finished listening to the overview of the chapters, you're ready for your quiz. And your quiz is due, of course, by 11:30 p.m. Sunday, the 22nd of January. Now, you do not have to wait till then to take it, but after 11:30, it shuts down. Even if you're in the middle of it, it'll shut down. Lesson 3 chapters 5 and 6 are going to open about the same time that closes. They open Sunday night, January the 22nd at 11:30. However, since we've completed 4 chapters, we'll have a test now. I would suggest you take your test before you begin lesson 3. Like once the quiz and the questions are completed, take the test. Now, the test's not due until Monday at 11:30 p.m., whereas your 4 questions and your quiz are due Sunday at 11:30 p.m.